The key point for us tonight is to recognize that time is not uniform. Time is a physical property. That's what these changes teach us. See, time itself varies with mass, acceleration, and gravity, among other things. You and I exist in more than 3 dimensions. In fact, we actually, apparently, exist in about 10 dimensions. Back in 1854, in June of 1854, Georges Riemann gave the most important scientific lecture that's ever been given, where he introduced the concept of metric tensors. That provided the mathematics, which then 60 years later resulted in Einstein's general theory of relativity, because it was Riemann that provided the mathematics for it. And Einstein applied that, recognizing we have 4-dimensional space-time, more than 3 dimensions. That's what we call a hyperspace. A hyperspace is any space within more than 3 dimensions. And Einstein went to his death frustrated because he didn't have the insight to go another dimension. It took Kaluza and Klein back in 1953 to recognize by adding some more dimensions they could resolve light and supergravity issues. It was in 1963 that Yang, Mills, the two of them, developed fields that explain electromagnetic and both the nuclear forces, the weak and the strong nuclear forces. The point is, as scientists began to realize that there are more dimensions involved than we're generally aware of, it started to resolve the classic dilemmas in physics. Even as recently as 1984 and following, scientists are now speculating that we actually live, for mathematical reasons, in 10-dimensional. They speak of superstrings and so forth, and that we live in 10 dimensions. I mention this because I think it's really interesting to discover that 800 years ago, in the 12th century, we had Nachmanides, who was a Hebrew sage, in his study of Genesis chapter 1, came to the conclusion that the reality consists of 10 dimensions. 4 are directly knowable, and 6 are not knowable in his terms. What makes that interesting is this ancient Hebrew sage, studying Genesis 1, came to the same conclusions that our particle physicists today have concluded, that we live in 10 dimensions. 4 are directly measurable, 3 spatial dimensions, length, width, and height, and time. 6 of them are curled, to use mathematical terms, are curled in less than 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, and therefore they're just inferable by indirect means. Now, this whole idea of the 10-dimensional universe is suggestive, because the original creation, of course, is described in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. But we have sin introduced, and we have the curse pronounced. And some speculate that that's when the creation was fractured, that we are left with 4 dimensions we can directly sense, length, width, height, and time, 3 spatial dimensions and time, and 6 hyperdimensions. We call these 4 dimensions that we can sense the physical dimensions. And the ones that may be hyperdimensional may embrace what we generally defer by calling the spiritual dimensions. But there is a reality larger than our physical dimensions. We now know that. But that's what we're going to start moving into as we start talking about prophecy. See, the other misconceptions, the part we want to do when we get into this kind of a subject is to set aside baggage, misconceptions, presumptions that are inaccurate, that we all have. Most of us assume that time is linear. We assume that tomorrow will be like yesterday, next week like last week, next month like last week. We think that time is linear intrinsically. And when we were in school, the teacher put a line on the blackboard from left to right. The left end would be the beginning of something, the birth of a famous person or the founding of an empire or what have you. The right end of the line might be the end of that person or the empire, what have you. How many of you made timelines in school? Can I see a show of hands? Sure, we all have. And so because of that, we jump to some conclusions. Incidentally, this dimension we call time is a strange dimension because we can only move in one direction. You see, we can only move forward and we can look back. What we can't do is move back and look forward. Whenever I often, in an audience like this, I'll ask, how many of you remember tomorrow? When I give that talk in California, I hesitate because I'm sure I'll get a hand or two, but anyway. See, we move forward in time and we can look back in terms of history. But we can't move back. It's a popular theme in fictional literature to go back in time. It's a very colorful instrument of writers, but it leads to paradoxes, because if you can go back in time, you could kill your grandfather, and then that starts to lead to some problems. So, and you can play around with those ideas as just mind stretchers, but the idea of moving back in time is generally rejected by most serious thinkers. But the other side of this is what we're going to try to do. We're going to indulge in the opportunity to look forward. But I want to show you why that would require a supernatural insight, and that's exactly the point we're going to make. And so there's another concept we need to set aside, and that's the concept of eternity. Because we think of time as linear, when we encounter the concept in church or wherever of eternity, we tend to assume that that's like a line that starts at infinity on the left and goes to infinity on the right. We tend to visualize God as someone who has lots of time. That's very poetic. It's very colorful. It shows up in our hymns, in Amazing Grace, what is the fourth stanza, when we've been there 10,000 years and so forth. We tend to imagine eternity as simply having lots of time. That's fine, but it happens to be, the idea that God is somebody that has lots of time is very poetic, but it's bad physics. What do I mean by that? Is God subject to the restrictions of mass? Hardly. Or acceleration? Or gravity? Of course not. God is not someone with lots of time. He is outside the restrictions of time itself. And this uniqueness of God is his personal imprint. It's like his signature. It's an attribute that he exploits to authenticate his messages. That's what Isaiah alludes to in Isaiah 57, verse 15. He says, "Thus saith the high and the lofty one that inhabiteth eternity." Now, since God has the technology to create us in the first place, he certainly has the means to get a message to us, obviously. The trick is, how does he authenticate his message? How does he let us know that the message is really from him and not some kind of contrivance or a fraud of some kind? Well, one of the ways he can do that is by relying on an attribute that's uniquely his to authenticate his message. That's what Isaiah talks about in Isaiah 46. He says, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times, the things that are not yet done. There are dozens of verses like the scripture, but they all point to the fact that God says, I alone know the end from the beginning. God is very jealous of that prerogative. That's why seeking a horoscope or trying to indulge in some occultic medium to learn the future is considered an offense against our Creator, because he preserves that prerogative for himself. Now, let's talk a little bit about the geometry of eternity. We've represented here as a line drawn on a blackboard. Let's take that line and put it in 3 dimensions. As we look back, we call that the past. We're in the present. Ahead of us is the future. For us, life is a sequence of events. There are events that have passed, they're behind us. There are events forthcoming that are ahead of us. For us, it's like a parade. It's very analogous in a sense, like someone sitting on the curb watching a parade come around the corner. For that person on the curb that's sitting there, we see the bands, the marching units, the floats, whatever, come one at a time and passes. Life is like a passing parade. But you see, for someone who is outside the plane of that existence, say inhabiting eternity, they're no longer restricted to that sequence of events. They can see the end from the beginning. For God, the past, the present, and the future are simultaneous. God often speaks prophetically as if it's already happened, because as far as he's concerned, it has. He's outside our time domain. The analogy, it's a little clumsy, but the analogy that's often used, it's like you're in a helicopter above the parade. For you, outside the plane of that parade's existence, you can see the beginning and the end simultaneously. It's a crude example, but it's perhaps graphic. That's the analogy we're talking about. My favorite quote of Dr. Albert Einstein, it says, people like us who believe in physics know that the distinction between the past, the present, and the future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. You see, this past, present, and future thing is the only thing we know because we're within the time dimension.